Holy God, you have called us into being and given us purposes to fulfill. Each of us has unique gifts, and all our gifts are needed in your world. Strengthen us for service ahead. Give us the courage to let go of all that holds us back from fulfilling your desires. Give us the wisdom and the creativity to discover new ways of being so that we may do your work.
The time in our service where we collect an offering. To those attending MCC Boston through our YouTube page, you too can participate by going to our website at mccboston.org and clicking on the donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. This evening, in recognition of Women's History Month, we're highlighting MCC's own Reverend Elder Nancy Wilson. Reverend Nancy found MCC at MCC Boston in 1972 while attending seminary and immediately became our first associate pastor as well as a queer activist. Reverend Nancy wrote about her work at MCC Boston and some of her experiences in serving the queer church in 1972, stating, "The first stripper I ever met, I met at church. Her stage name was Frosty Winters. She was a headliner at the 2 o'clock club in the combat zone of Boston, and she was a lesbian. Frosty and her lover Claire found MCC Boston in the first few weeks of our existence in 1972. Claire, though butch by most standards, had a brand new baby boy, and Claire and Frosty came to MCC Boston partly because she wanted her son Eric to be baptized. Eric was my first baptism. He was an adorable 6-month-old healthy baby, and it thrilled me to touch him with the water, to hold him in my arms, to welcome him to the people of God who called themselves MCC Boston. 2 weeks after Eric's baptism, I got a late-night hysterical call from Claire asking me to come immediately. When I got there, it was quite a scene. Frosty had moved out. The two had had a fight over Frosty's expensive heroin habit, and Claire was worried about Frosty's dealer and the danger to the baby. Claire was quite drunk and crying, as was the baby. Almost immediately, I noticed the gun. Claire started to threaten to kill herself with it. As she raced out of the house, I followed her, spinning her around, at which point she shoved the gun in my stomach and said, "If you try to stop me, I'll blow you away." This is one of those pastoral moments that my 6 weeks of seminary thus far hadn't prepared me for. There was no time for theological reflection as I mustered up all the priestly authority I could manage and said sternly, and I hope convincingly, "Give me that gun." And she did. She just handed me the gun. Back in the apartment with the gun underneath my jacket, we sat as I held Claire while she cried. I left that evening not ever thinking about calling police or child welfare services. They would have been so homophobic, and Claire would have immediately lost her son. As this story illustrates, it was quite challenging and even at times life-threatening to be in service in the early days of MCC Boston. Reverend Nancy left MCC Boston in 1974 to form the Worcester Study Group, which grew into Morning Star MCC. She was ordained in MCC in 1975 and went on to serve as pastor of MCC Detroit, MCC Los Angeles, Church of the Trinity MCC in Sarasota, Florida, and as co-senior pastor of Sun Coast Cathedral MCC in Venice, Florida. Reverend Nancy was elected as an elder in our denomination in 1976 and served as the denomination's vice moderator from 1993 to 2001. In 2005, she was elected as the second moderator of Metropolitan Community Churches, following our founder, Reverend Elder Troy Perry, and served 2 terms before retiring from that position in 2016. Besides her leadership positions, Reverend Nancy has served MCC's official delegate to the World Council of Churches General Assemblies. And in 2011, President Barack Obama appointed Reverend Nancy to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, and following his re-election in 2013, requested that Reverend Nancy give the scripture reading at the inaugural prayer service at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., being the first openly gay clergy member to ever participate. Reverend Nancy has published multiple books, including Outing the Bible, Queer Folks, God, Jesus, and the Christian Scriptures, Outing the Church, 40 Years in the Queer Christian Movement, Our Tribe, Queer Folks, God, Jesus, and the Bible, and her latest, I Love to Tell the Story, 100+ stories of justice, inclusion, and hope. Reverend Nancy has been interviewed by numerous local, national, and international news agencies and has spoken at national and international conferences on matters relating to LGBTQI community and social justice issues, including eradicating human trafficking, a queer response to climate change, racial reconciliation and economic justice, HIV/AIDS, women's reproductive freedom, religion and social change, and marriage equality. Really an almost unparalleled resume. Friends and members of MCC Boston, we have much to be thankful for courageous leaders like Reverend Elder Nancy Wilson, for her activism and her dedication to MCC. So this week, give thanks for the strength and character of our women leaders, and then recommit yourself to this community, enabling the continuation of this ever-evolving path toward full queer equality.
Our reading tonight is from Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 36. About 8 days after saying this, Jesus took Peter, John, and James and went up onto a mountain to pray. While Jesus was praying, his face changed in appearance, and the clothes he wore became dazzling white. Suddenly, two people were there talking with Jesus, Moses and Elijah. They appeared in glory and spoke of the prophecy that Jesus was about to fulfill in Jerusalem. Peter and the others had already fallen into deep sleep, but upon awakening, they saw Jesus' glory and the two people who were standing next to him. When the two were leaving, Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, how good it is for us to be here. Let's set up 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Peter didn't really know what he was saying. While Peter was speaking, a cloud came and overshadowed them. The disciples grew fearful as others entered it. Then from the cloud came a voice which said, "This is my own, my chosen one. Listen to him." When the voice had finished speaking, they saw no one but Jesus standing there. The disciples kept quiet, telling nothing of what they had seen at that time to anyone.
Okay, cards on the table. I do not get the Transfiguration. I don't get the story. I don't get why it's a whole Sunday, actually last Sunday, sorry about that. I don't even get the Sufjan Stevens song, none of it. I mean, I understand what happens in the story, but I don't see what the big deal is. Jesus goes up to a mountain with his 3 favorite apostles, though we're not supposed to talk about that. His appearance changes. There's some clouds. There's a voice from the heavens. Moses and Elijah are there. I can see all the parts of the story, even the part where, as usual, Peter also doesn't get it. But I just don't see the point. So Jesus goes up to the mountain for a costume change. So does Cher, but she doesn't get her own Sunday on the church calendar. And now, after having read the commentaries and picking over every single little point, I still don't get it. I understand a lot of the points of the story more. I understand that Moses and Elijah likely symbolize the law and the prophets, both attesting to the primacy of Jesus' ministry in terms of God's action in the world. I know that when they speak of Jesus' exodus, they're referring to the crucifixion and resurrection. I understand why the early Jesus movement would have a stake in having Moses and Elijah both sign off on their Messiah, and I understand why Luke would include these 2 figures in his telling of the tale. Although you can add to the list that I don't get how anyone besides Jesus knows that Moses and Elijah are Moses and Elijah, since I don't imagine either of them ever sat for a portrait. I understand that the mountain scenery and the dazzling white clothes are likely hearkening back to Moses on Mount Sinai and are meant to be seen as a reflection of these events. I understand that Jesus' face and appearance changed and his clothing became dazzling white, and I understand that Luke says his appearance changed, where Mark says he was transfigured, and I even understand why each would describe it in the way they do. I understand that when Peter suggests building 3 tents, he's referencing the Festival of Booths, and I understand that he's attempting to elevate Jesus to the same position as the heroes of the faith, even though the heroes of the faith just showed up and elevated Jesus above themselves, making Peter's gesture a little silly. I understand that the voice that appears from the heavens is meant to be heard by the reader as well, with the understanding that Jesus is the chosen one of God and we should listen to and follow him. I even understand silly little inconsequential things like that Mark says this happened 6 days later and Luke says 8 days. Or that some people think this is meant to be a resurrection narrative, but it was inserted back into an earlier part of the text. I just don't get what the big deal is. I already intended to follow Jesus and listen to him because I already believed he was the chosen one of God. I already believed that Moses and Elijah, speaking as symbolic representations of the law and the prophets, approved of Jesus and awaited his actions as fulfillment of God's work on earth. I already believed that Jesus was something more than human and therefore someone that could miraculously transfigure himself into a vision of dazzling white. I already knew that Peter sticks his foot in his mouth every other page. I just don't see what is meant to be revealed in this text that I didn't already know or believe. And of course, this text isn't for me. None of the Bible was written with me in mind because none of the writers could have fathomed my existence. At the time of writing, there was probably more need to convince people of Jesus' divinity in the 1st century CE. Though in that case, I don't get what telling this story does to convince people, since anyone could easily have written the same thing. Nonetheless, within its own context, I can think of a lot of reasons why this story would have been important to its audience. But that doesn't help me understand why it's seen as such an event now. And I realize that I'm playing fast and loose with the concept of an event, but at least in my day-to-day, if Theo Twitter is all talking about the same thing, that qualifies as an event. At a certain point in my confusion, though, I started thinking about what transfiguration means. If Luke is to be trusted here, transfiguration is simply a change of appearance. Though to be fair, the noun here also indicates that it involves a change in nature sometimes as well. So then it can be said that a transfiguration is no more than seeing a different depiction of Jesus. Not a photograph, perhaps not strictly accurate, but a new picture of Jesus nonetheless. Like, you know how some people say that there's a different version of you in the head of every person you know? Well, there are vastly more versions of Jesus existing in a lot of different heads. And if that's what transfiguration is, no more than Jesus appearing in a different perspective, then I begin to understand why it's so hard for me to feel as if this transfiguration scene is worth writing home about. In a way, transfiguration of Jesus is a language we all speak fluently because we transfigure Jesus all the time. C.S. Lewis transfigured Jesus into a magical lion named Aslan. Composer Andrew Lloyd Webber transfigured Jesus into a rock star, while composer Stephen Schwartz transfigured Jesus into a singing hippie with suspenders. The VeggieTales franchise recently broke one of their own rules when their Twitter account transfigured the baby Jesus into a pea in a manger. And in Jeff Whitty's play, The Further Adventures of Hedda Gabler, the audience is treated to a variety pack of different Jesuses all on one stage at one time. We are more than accustomed to seeing different versions of Jesus in our day-to-day, so why would we be enthralled by another transfiguration? Especially when the transfiguration we see in this passage is one of the most commonly encountered divine power Jesus. Dazzling white robe Jesus, Jesus in the clouds. We like to think of Jesus as powerful and transcendent. We like to think of Jesus moving mountains and raising the seas. We like to see Jesus in thunder and storms and riding on a strong wind. We like for our Jesus to be powerful in all the ways that we are not, and more importantly, on our side. So that's the image that we keep repeating. And that repetition can be dangerous. For instance, that's how Jesus came to be such a big fan of empire and war. The same Jesus who healed one of the very Roman guards who were coming to escort him to his death, The same Jesus who told us that if someone strikes us on the face, we should turn the other cheek and insist that they must see us refusing to surrender our dignity when they hit us. That same Jesus is suddenly a big fan of the U.S. military and the U.S. in general, especially when we bring violence to others, when we refuse to open our arms to the outcasts, when we show no mercy to refugees, when we wrap ourselves up in star-spangled certainty and refuse to see those hurting because of our actions and our attitudes. You see, our picture of Jesus not only tells us who we believe Jesus is, they also give us permission to imitate the Jesus of our choice. We emphasize divine power, Jesus, not only because we want power on our side, we also emphasize divine power, Jesus, because we want permission to use our power in our own ways. So we transfigure the Jesus of the Bible into the Jesus of our imaginations, who hates all the same people we do and approves of everything we do. This is also how Jesus became white, and I'm going to pause here for a moment because it needs to be said. One of the moments I will always remember from my time working with children in Honduras is when I realized that the kids there also made Jesus and angels white in their coloring books. All the other people had brown skin tones like them, but Jesus was always white, and the angels were always white and blonde. And if we lived in a world in which every child colored Jesus in their own skin tone, I think that'd be wonderful, because that's what incarnation is about. The ability to see the divine not as something far off and inaccessible, but something that is with us and within us. But we are still in a world where young children of color understand the messages we send them, that to be divine is to be light-skinned, and that is not okay. And on that note, another important theological vocabulary word when discussing transfigurations is incarnation. The act of God being made flesh and dwelling among us. Because so many of the different pictures of Jesus we show each other are our small response to the incarnation. They come from our attempts to imitate the incarnation by showing a Jesus who is even more with us. Human and suffering, yes, but also able to speak our language, understand our culture, and move among us. For instance, and this elaboration comes with a fun fact I just learned, Aslan, the Jesus lion from the Chronicles of Narnia, was not intended by C.S. Lewis to be a symbol or metaphor or an allegory. Rather, Aslan is intended to be the form Jesus would take were he to have become incarnate in a magical world of talking animals instead of our own world. You see, the form changes because the community being reached is different and will be more responsive to this picture of Jesus than ours. Now, of course, when we're talking about Jesus, there is incarnation and there is the incarnation. In the incarnation, Jesus is God made flesh, made to walk among humanity. This one is literal and therefore bound by its own reality. Jesus appears as a particular human in a particular context, and that does not shift aside from this one passage we're discussing today. But these smaller cultural incarnations point to all the ways Jesus reveals himself to us. There are any number of cultural incarnations of Jesus included in the array of transfigurations through art and storytelling and any number of other creative endeavors. Embracing these incarnations does not mean that we think Jesus was literally a Chinese woman or an African child or indeed a white man. It means that we can see that Jesus is as present and accessible in those cultures as in ours, because in the end, American Jesus is himself a cultural incarnation, no more real despite our efforts than any of the other cultural pictures of Jesus we create and share. And it needs to be said that these pictures of Jesus are by no means powerless imitations. All gods have the power we give them. And I mean the very straightforward gods like Yahweh and Allah and Ganesh. And I also mean those symbols we deify like money, power, or Lady Gaga. When we invest our power and energy worshiping a god, even the picture of a god, even the cultural idea of a god, then we give that god power. That power can be used for good. That power can be used to tell the sick and the broken, the marginalized and beaten down, the poor and suffering that God is with them. That when they suffer, God suffers too. And that their suffering is temporary. That they need only hold on until hope emerges brilliantly like an Easter Sunday. That power can be used to shore up those most in need and give them refuge and respite. That power was over the civil rights movement and the abolition movement and any number of other struggles for justice in our world. When we invest energy into these pictures of Jesus, that returns to us in hope for the despairing, in justice for those done unjustly, in the belief in a better world that God can help us to build. And that power can also be used for evil. That power can convince otherwise good people that God has chosen them to the exclusion of their siblings in the human race. That power can tell them it's okay when they do violence, when they demean others, when they kill directly and when they kill indirectly through their apathy. That power was in the Third Reich and in the Klan, and it is with us today when American flag Jesus tells his followers that what defines a Christian is their support for empire and war. That power that has been given to American Jesus is working its destruction across the world as we speak, leaving more people daily in the grip of poverty and disease and violence. So what does that mean for us down here if the Jesus we worship is a cultural incarnation just the same as the Jesus that others worship who would spell our doom? Then what right have we to say that our Jesus is the correct one? We could argue semantics and point out that the historical Jesus was a Palestinian Jew, a man who lived in poverty and embraced the poor, a man who sought to heal those broken by the powers of violence in society, and a man who was publicly executed when he defied empire. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, what gives a cultural incarnation power isn't factual evidence. What gives a cultural incarnation power is what captures the imagination of the people. The same way the Exodus captures the imagination of the Hebrews, the same way our God has captured the imagination of millions seeking justice and liberation throughout history, and millions of others seeking subjugation and exploitation of power. But how can we move forward knowing that our cultural incarnation of God, our picture of Jesus, is right? Is the one that would be most in line with the historical Jesus and the divine Jesus that we believe in? There's another important thing I left out about the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration is not incarnation. The picture of Jesus we see here is not one of our cultural incarnations, or rather, the picture we see here could very well be a cultural incarnation of Luke's. But the one that actually stood on the mountain, that is not some picture of Jesus we are showing each other. In fact, the Transfiguration is just about the only time prior to the resurrection that we see Jesus momentarily shrug off the incarnation. And that's what the miracle is. Not just that Jesus was made dazzling white and pretty, it's that for just a moment, 3 regular humans standing on a mountain were blessed to see what Jesus' true form looks like, when he's not taking on a mantle of humanity to be able to bless us and live among us. That Jesus on the mountain was Jesus on his own terms, just for a moment, revealing himself to a few trusted apostles. In a world where we are swimming in pictures of Jesus, in different versions of him, all of whom have a power over us that could do great works and accomplish great evil, there was just one moment where a few choice people got to see Jesus as he really exists, without the shrouds he throws over his face to allow us to see him and speak with him. But of course, we don't get to see that. It was one moment 2,000 years ago, and it is inaccessible to us. So for us, we most likely won't get to see any unfiltered Jesus in our lifetimes. The only thing left to do is trust. Trust that Jesus is revealing himself to us today in another way. Maybe still on the mountaintop, maybe still with dazzling white clothing, maybe still with Moses and Elijah. We won't know until we see it. But I heard once that the sheep know the shepherd's voice. And I believe that those of us in God's fold are able to hear God and listen to God and know who God is, apart from all the hundreds of pictures of him we've been shown, some accurate and some completely off base. I believe that we have the power to hear God's words and to, in a way, become little pictures of Jesus ourselves, carrying his light into the world, capturing the imagination of all those who have ears to hear, eyes to see, and hearts to love. I believe that there is still a Jesus that some of us are blessed to know apart from his millions of places in the cultural imagination. And I believe it is within our power as Christians to perceive that Jesus and to share him with others. Receive this benediction. Some days have no beginning, and some days have no end. Some roads are straight and narrow, and some roads only bend. So let us say a prayer for every living thing, walking towards the light from the cross of a king. We long to be a picture of Jesus, of Jesus.